Excuse me. Hello, welcome to White Davy Gardening in Worm Farm. Today we are going to be discussing how to store worm castings. And I know this is something that I have discussed before, but today we're going to have a little bit more detail regarding how to store it. Yes, hi Joseph, how are you? I'm doing okay. It's nice to have you on the live. It's the first seeing you. So welcome. Sorry for the distraction. Yes, so we're going to be looking at how to store worm castings. Now, worm casting is very rich in nutrients and very rich in beneficial microbes. So, for that reason, the way we store our worm casting is of vital importance. We want to ensure that we get the most out of it, right? So, that is why I'm having this discussion so that we can look at the best way to store the castings. If you are someone who have worm castings that need to be stored, then please feel free to share how you store your castings, because we all may not store our castings in the same way. And then when we share how we do so, then those who are participating in the live may be able to benefit from your method of doing it. Okay, so if you have been worm farming for a while, or if you live in areas that experience freezing temperature where you won't be able to have a garden all year round, then you may find yourself with more castings than you can use in the growing season, or after the growing season ended, the worms do not stop producing castings, so you may end up with castings that you have to wait for the next season to use. So how do you go about storing it? Now, castings, as I mentioned, is very rich in microbes. So, one of the things you have to keep in mind when you're storing your worm castings is that you do not want the castings to freeze, because if that happens, the microbes in it will die. And since as the microbes are so important both to the plant and to your soil, you don't want the microbes to die. Now, if it is the case where the castings get frozen and you lose the microbe population in your castings, you can revive the population, but it won't be as effective, or the population will not be as much as it would have been if you hadn't allowed it to freeze. But the way you can revive the population to some extent would be to add a few worms to the castings and then give them just a small amount of food. And you might want to put these food scraps all over your casting. So you want to put the container with worms in different locations in your castings, but that using a lot of small containers depend on the size container that you are storing your castings in. If it is just a small container, then just one little container with worms and food scraps will work. And then eventually you're going to have to extract these worms from the castings, but that will help to revitalize the microbe population. But the best way to do this is to just ensure that the casting does not freeze, because no matter what method you try to use to rebuild the microbe population, it just won't be the same as before. Now, the next thing is that these microbes that are in your castings, they need air to survive and they need moisture to survive. So, what you can do if you are storing your castings for a long time, I know that in my region we have winter for 7 months out of the year. Well, between winter and spring, it is between 7 to 9 months out of the year. So we only can do gardening for 3 months, which means that all that other time, whatever casting is produced has to be stored. So one of the things that I do to ensure that my worms are getting sufficient air, and I do have a lot of worms, which means that I have lots of castings. So I have to aerate. It's important that I aerate my castings once in a while. Your castings cannot be allowed to dry out. As I mentioned before, the microbes rely on those moisture to live. So you have to moisten the castings occasionally. No, you don't want to pour water over your castings. It is better to use either a watering can and even to distribute the water on the surface of the castings, or to use a sprayer if you have one to apply the moisture. You don't want to have a lot of moisture either. Now, when you're storing your castings, you don't want it to be very wet. And the reason that you don't want it to be very wet is that once the castings become so muddy, the moisture that is in there is going to fill up all the air pockets, which means that the castings will not have any good airflow and all your beneficial life form will be lost. So you don't want your castings to be stored while it is in a muddy state. So if you have harvested your castings, for some who sift their castings, then they don't really have to worry about it being too muddy, because naturally you would have had to dry it out to some extent before you be able to sift it. There are those who don't really foresee about if one and two worms get in their garden, or they're not concerned about not too refined particles in their castings because they're just using it in their garden. So for such ones, their castings can be too wet. I'm not saying that because you don't sift it, it makes your casting wet. I'm saying that if you have very wet castings, if you're someone who is not sifting it, which would require you to dry it out, then your castings may be too wet and then you put it in storage like that. Now, the disadvantage, apart from the fact that you won't have proper airflow, is that if the casting is allowed to dry out, whether accidentally or otherwise, if it is allowed to dry out fully and it was in that muddy state, sometimes you will find that the castings become dry lumps, rock hard lumps, almost like cement mix. And once that happens, you cannot break it up and you cannot revitalize it, so it becomes garbage. So you don't want your castings to reach to that extent. And mark you, sometimes you may have to go on a trip, or you might have some emergency, or sometimes your trip might last a very long time. So you don't really get to add moisture to your worm casting or to tend to your worm castings. So sometimes in your absence or your emergency, your casting may dry out. So that is why it is important to ensure that before you store your castings, you make sure it is not in a muddy or very soaking wet state. Right, so you cannot revive it once it reach that state. So what you can do to dry out your castings is to spread it out so that it can get good airflow. You don't want to allow it to dry out fully. You just want it to dry out to the point where it's loose and fluffy. Yeah, so once it reaches that consistency where it is loose and fluffy, then it is good to go. So what you're going to be doing as you are drying out the casting is every now and then you're going to have to go there and gently loosen it up, whether you're going to be running it through your fingers or you're going to try to break up those large clumps. But you want to do what you can to keep it in a refined state, because while it is drying out, you don't want it to be drying in that clumpy state, because it can be difficult to separate if you do. But don't allow it to dry out fully, because then you will lose all of the beneficial life form. The good thing though about worm casting is that even if it is allowed to dry out fully, as long as it's not drying into that clumpy rock hard state, is that it still will have all the nutrients that it had before it froze or before it dried out. But so this goes for both drying and freezing, but the nutrients will still be there, and that you want to make sure that you have not just the nutrients but the microbes and other beneficial life forms as well. Now the casting that you are trying to store will dry out from the top first, and sometimes the top can be very dry while the bottom is very wet. Now, one thing that you can do to ensure that the casting is evenly wet is to aerate the castings occasionally. So, depending on the size container that you have, if it is a small one, you may be able to cover it and give it a shake to mix it up. Or sometimes you might have to, if you're using a large container, you might have to just stir it with your hand or with some tool that you may have, with a fork or something. But you may have to stir it because you want to mix in the dry portion with the wet portion so that it is evenly moist. And when you're doing that, you're not supposed to add water to the castings, because you want to get rid of the extra water that is in the bottom of the casting of the container. And at the same time, you want to moisten the upper portion that is dry. So just stir it and make sure that it is evenly moist. Right, so this is another way that you can ensure that your castings get enough air supply, has enough moisture, but is not too moist. Now, what kind of containers or how can you store your castings? There are some who store their casting in plastic bags, and if you're doing so, I would recommend that you do one of two things. Either use a breathable plastic bag, or even if it is not a plastic bag, whatever container you're using, you want to make sure that the casting has a good airflow. So if you're using plastic bag that is not breathable, then make sure that it stays open. You can put something over the top of the plastic bag though, because you want to keep in the moisture, but you, at the same time, whatever you're putting on top must be something that is breathable. So you can put it in plastic bag that's not breathable, but just make sure that the surface of the bag is open. You can use containers that are not breathable, but again, that has to be open too. So if you have containers that you're keeping your casting in, and you are going to be covering the container with a lid, do not tighten the cover on it. So make sure that you always have good enough airflow. And it doesn't really matter what it is that you store your casting in, as long as one, you want to make sure that the airflow is not too much either, because you know that air will dry out your material. So you want to make sure that although it is breathable, you don't want to have a lot of air rushing through the container that you're using. So that is how. Oh, hi Melanie, how are you? Yeah, so that is how you store your castings for the best result. So do you guys have a worm farm, and if so, how do you store your castings? And are you able to store your castings indoors, or do you store yours outdoors? So I'm, like I mentioned before, I'm in a region where it can be freezing temperature for at least 5 months out of the year. The rest of the months out of the 9 months are usually cold, but at least 5 months out of the month, 5 months out of the year, we're going to have freezing temperatures in my region. So I have to store it indoors. Of course, sometimes storing castings can be a big challenge, because if you're doing it in your home, then space might be an issue. So sometimes gardeners will ask if they're able to store the castings outdoors. If you don't have freezing temperatures, then yes, you can store it outdoors. And the tip that I just gave you regarding what you can do, because sometimes it is just not an option to store your castings indoors and you're in a freezing temperature, so the castings will freeze. So if that happens and you want to build the micro population back, then you can just use that tip that I gave, where you put a few worms in the castings with a bit of wood scraps, and that will to a small extent build back some of the micro population. Yes, but you want to do your best to keep it indoors. Sometimes gardeners will ask questions like, okay, my growing season has ended and I have lots of castings. Can I put it in the garden? Or they want to revitalize the garden right away because they have the extra castings. And sometimes, if you're like me, you like to get an early start on amending your soil and revitalizing your garden. So they may want to know if they can put the castings in the garden over the fall. No, you can do that, but then and again it will freeze, like I mentioned. But if you have extra castings and there is nowhere to put it, then put it in the garden. Yes, you lose some of the microbes, but you can still put it in the garden, because the good thing is when you put it in your garden, it's going to be amending your soil over the winter when you put it in, and you want to make sure that you mix it in. So it will still have the nutrients that your plant need, and it will make your garden nice and fluffy. It will help to make your garden less compacted. It will encourage good moisture retention and stuff like that. So if you cannot store it indoors over the winter, then just add it and mix it into your garden soil, because at the end of the day, what is important is that you still get the nutrients from it. You want to get the most, but in a worst case scenario, that is what you do. If you're able to store it indoors though, and away from freezing, then by all means do so. If you're able to only store some of it indoors because of the space issue, then the extra portion you just put it out in your garden. Yeah, and don't feel bad about it, because you know how we are as worm farmers. We tend to be sorry for our worms and for the microbes and stuff that may be in our castings. And some of us may even feel guilty about it, but when you have done your best, there is nothing really to feel guilty about. Yeah, so that is how you store your castings. And sometimes you're able to store your casting in your garage. I don't know if the garage is, if you have a heated garage or not. Okay, Melanie, you said you're doing great. Good. Yes, I don't know if you have a heated garage or not, but if you're storing it where there is no heat, then naturally it is going to freeze. So it's better at that point in time to put it out in your garden, because at least when you're putting it out in your garden at that point in time, it would not be during the freezing temperatures. So it would have had a little bit of cooler weather, but warm enough where some of the benefits and the microbes can do some of their thing in the soil before temperatures reach freezing. So if you have a garage or a shed or whatever where you store your castings, that's not heated, then you can just put the castings in the garden. If you have a heated space, sometimes the eating might not be the best. So, for example, if the heating comes from above rather than from the floor region, then chances are that your floor will be cold. So if the floor is cold, you don't want to store your castings on the floor. Even though they're in a container, you want to have it elevated off the floor, because you may find that all of the castings may freeze depending on how cold the region is that you're in, or some of it may freeze. So it is a good idea to keep it elevated off the floor if it is the case where the heating in your garage comes from the roof down and not from the floor. Okay, so these are some of the things that you can do to ensure that you maximize the benefits of your worm castings. So if you guys have any questions, please feel free to ask. And if I'm able to answer them, then I'll do so. And if you have points that you want to share regarding how you store your castings or how often you harvest your castings, then please feel free to do so. For me, harvesting casting is something that I have to do regularly, because as most of you who follow my channel know, that my farm is, although I use it mostly for my garden, it is a commercial worm farm. So I have to be harvesting quite often because my worms do make a lot of castings. So pretty much previous years I would try to harvest like every 3 months or every 6 months, depending on how fast my worms are eating, because with the temperatures that I get in my region, even though my garage is heated, my worms will slow down, so they will take a pretty long time to go through the material that I'm giving them. So sometimes even 6 months I don't have to harvest. But I noticed that this winter, for whatever reason, they don't seem to be slowing down. I don't know if maybe because it's not as cold as previous winters. Of course, it does get cold as it should be, or colder than it should be, but it doesn't really last long. So the worms don't seem to be slowing down as much as before. So now I find myself having to be harvesting very regularly. In fact, I just went through with the last 2 weeks, I've had to harvest pretty much all my worm bins and get them restarted. So when you have to harvest a lot or frequently, then you find that storing your castings can become an issue. But it's definitely worth it. The good thing, though, for those who are just doing worm farming for their own use, is that they don't have to worry about, depending on the size garden they have anyway, as long as they have somewhere warm where they can store the castings, they don't really have to worry about having tons of castings, and they don't really have to worry about having tons of worms either. Hi, Newark Gardeners. It's been a long time. How are you doing, girl? Yeah, so they don't have to worry about tons of castings and having tons of worm, because one of the things is that unless the you can maintain the temperature that is ideal for your worms, then if not, even if the space is heated, the worms will slow down. And sometimes there are those who keep their worms in their basement, and the basement usually the heat does not come from the floor, it comes from the roof, which means that the basement is going to be cooler than upstairs. So for such ones that might be cooler, so the worms definitely are going to be slowing down in the winter, unless of course they provide additional heating for the worms. So you don't really have to worry about having too much worms or too much castings in that case, because what happens is that the worms are going to be regulating their population if they realize that they don't have a lot of space to grow their population, and they're going to slow down too with their heating if the place is a little cooler than it usually is. So you don't have to worry about getting an excess amount of castings that you will not be able to use or you will not be able to store. So let's see. Okay, growing my own is saying hi to Noah Gardner. Noah Gardner says, I'm good. And yes, it has been a while. Happy holidays. Okay. Yes, it's good to know that you are doing well. And I hope you guys will be able to get some good rest over the holiday. I know it is time of festivity for most, not for me. I don't celebrate Christmas. So I know a lot of people will be partying at this time, or even just if they're not partying, they will be having their family gathering and stuff. So make sure you get some rest in between. Yeah. So anyway, this is all the information that I have for you guys today. I know a lot of people are busy at this time of year trying to get preparing for the New Year's. For those who don't celebrate Christmas like myself, this is a time where you try to bring a close to the end of the year and get everything, try to plan what you want to accomplish for the next year and stuff like that. And then for those who celebrate the holidays or gather with family, you might be busy getting those things prepared. So I won't make it a long live today so that you guys can get back to what you have to do. So I hope during that time, though, you guys will be very careful when driving on the road, when partying. Make sure you have designated drivers if you're going to be drinking. Um, be careful of distancing, social distancing, and all of that, because I would like to see you guys again next year and know that you're all safe. So make sure that you guys do your best to be safe. Okay, so hopefully I will see you guys again next year and that all will be well. So take care until I see you again on Monday when we'll be doing our gardening Q&A live. So take care everyone and have a lovely weekend.